Can you sue somebody over defamation on a website where the person producing the website lives out of the jurisdiction and the website itself is hosted outside the jurisdiction? Well, yes you can, but it can get pretty complicated. So, what am I talking about? You may have heard of a political blogger called Guido Fawkes. And he just publishes like a website that comments on political stories. But he ran a story about somebody called Dale Vince. Dale Vince is some sort of eco-business person and also a supporter of the Labour Party. And he did an interview with The Times where he was asked, are Hamas defending themselves? And he said, well, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom. He said, I think one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Isn't that what they say? And on the back of that, Guido published a blog with the title, Vince Says Hamas Are, and in quote marks, freedom fighters. And he said, Vince said, well, that is saying I support Hamas, and I find that defamatory, I'm going to sue you. Now, Guido, that's not his real name actually, obviously, there's a person behind this, and somebody who'd made better notes. I can't get my notes out, it's too windy. But he said, well, I don't care. I live in Ireland and my website's hosted in the US. Do your worst. So he issued proceedings and he applied to the court. Now, you can sue over defamation if the defamatory comment is available in this jurisdiction. Although it has to have a sort of wider publication. There was a case called Jamil that's very significant in defamation. And that's where somebody it was quite a very defamatory comment. It was suggesting they were funding terrorism. But it transpired that it was on a website that only 4 people in this jurisdiction had read, and something like 3 of those were the claimant and his legal team. So the court said, notwithstanding the fact that technically you have a defamation case, the game is not just not worth the candle, it's not even worth the wick. So we're going to strike it out. And you get a lot of Jamil strikeouts now. I mean, pre-2013, when England and Wales was seen as a very claimant-friendly jurisdiction for defamation, you used to get a lot of forum shopping, libel tourism, as we call it, or libel terrorism, as they call it in the United States. There's actually an act in New York called the Libel Terrorism Act, which says they won't enforce English defamation judgments. And I am sure that they thought that they just misheard libel tourism. But in this particular case, the judge just said, okay, yes, you can sue. And the judge has given permission for what we call alternative service. Normally, if you want to serve a claim, you've got to do it physically, either by handing it to the relevant person or posting it to an address they are associated with, like their last known address. Or if it's a company, you can serve on their registered headquarters. You can also serve on lawyers if either the lawyer has said they'll accept service or the person has said my lawyers will accept service. But in this case he said, okay, you can serve the claim by email and also by post to the guy's address in Ireland. So we'll see what happens. Now, what happens if Guido just says, well, I'm just not interested, I'm not going to defend this? Well, theoretically, he'll get what we call judgment in default. If somebody issues a claim against you and you don't respond within 14 days, there's a thing called an acknowledgement of service saying, I will defend this claim, then you automatically get judgment in default. You just win by default. Now, if that's something like a money claim, I'm suing you over a debt, and you don't respond, I'll just get a piece of paper saying you owe me the money. It's slightly different with defamation, though, because even though you get judgment in default, there still has to be a hearing to see what the remedy should be, and you still have to satisfy the judge has to be satisfied with all the usual, the serious harm stuff that it has actually caused you serious harm, etc., etc., and injunctions might be appropriate. It's not automatic, so you can theoretically just completely ignore a defamation case and still, quotes, win, in that there won't actually be any negative outcome for you, because at the hearing the judge says, well, I don't find the serious harm test was satisfied, or something like that. But let's say he just doesn't fight it. Well, what are the sanctions? Well, there's something called a website banning order, and that can actually, you can send that order to the website host and say you cannot it doesn't matter, don't care what you do in the rest of the world, but you can't actually have that website available in the UK. That's normally used against in copyright breaches. It's a very popular one with illegal streaming of sort of sports events and things like that. And just a little aside, I mean, obviously nobody out there would have like an illegal viewer, and wouldn't be hacking into sort of sports channels. But one thing that they quite often do is they will broadcast an advert for something free, like, hey, free t-shirts available to anybody who writes in, but they won't actually encrypt that in the usual way. So anybody who's got a legitimate service will just see 30 seconds of static, but if you've got an illegal card, you'll still see the advert, and people will write off and go, oh, can I have a free t-shirt? And then they'll come back and say, right, you've clearly been watching this illegally, so stop it. So, I mean, like I say, nobody watching this would be doing that, but you do have to be careful. What about the claim itself? Does it have any merit? Now, interestingly, the Daily Mail and GB News have already settled claims arising out of this. Now, the Daily Mail one, they just put a headline saying, Vince says Hamas are freedom fighters. Hamas have a right to defend themselves, which actually isn't the quote. So they have settled. Now, I suppose, that was something that was, they probably just took a financial view. GB News also threw the towel in, even though they'd quoted correctly. But I must confess, just looking at this, I think he might actually have a defence, because Vince is saying the meaning is, I am a supporter of Hamas. And that's, supporting a prescribed organisation, which is a criminal offence, attracts a sentence of more than 12 months, so that would be deemed to cause serious harm. But is that actually what has been said? All he's done is he put the thing in quote marks, and it's possibly arguable that that is a legitimate interpretation of, what he actually said. But the problem is, as I've said before, we have this single meaning rule in defamation, which even the court says silly, but we're stuck with it. So even though a lot of people might say, actually, I think that's a legit interpretation of what I actually said, the court will say, well, what are most people going to think? And somebody looking at first glance, are they going to say, no, it's clearly expressing support from Hamas? I mean, the Forks site did actually show the relevant clip, albeit edited. So people can form their own view and say, well, I don't think that's a legit interpretation. So one defence open to the Forks site would be opinion, because he could argue and say, well, my opinion is that is expressing support for Hamas. Because by putting the clip there, other people can look at it and go, well, I disagree. I think you're misinterpreting that. So it's always a good idea, if you're commenting on anything, to always link back to what you're commenting on. Because if people can form their own view, courts are a lot more reluctant to find that defamation exists, because people, like I say, can form their own view, and then it does become a matter of opinion. And I suppose, technically speaking, it's a statement of fact, but the fact is, he's saying Hamas are freedom fighters. So can I think one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter? That's what they say, isn't it? Is that personally saying Hamas are freedom fighters, or is that just commenting on the general cliche about how these things can often be very, very subjective? We shall have to wait and see, but I'll keep you in the loop about this one, because it does seem like it might be quite interesting, just procedurally, whether Forks will actually do anything about it, or whether it goes to trial or goes to a hearing and the judge interprets the meaning. So there you go. As always, hope you found that vaguely useful, vaguely interesting. Where am I today? I'm somewhere very windy. I'm at a place called Wheel Coats, which is very near St Agnes. I'll put like a link in the description if you want to find it. But as you can see, this is an old tin mine. This is a really busy area for tin mines. There's loads of mine works around here, and old wheelhouses as we call them, including one not very far away that I was embroiled in some rather complex legal negotiations with Cornwall Council about, but I won't go into details about that because I'll just get my PTSD back. But yeah, they used to mine all the way out. They used to actually chase the tin streams about 2 miles out to sea. So there you go. Oh yeah, if you did like that, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing and YouTubey things. Did I actually say that? I can't remember. I'm going to see now.